William Dickinson's time on the LSU campus wasn't long by teaching standards, but his legacy, his impact, continues to this day. Dickinson arrived on the LSU campus in 1999 and was named to the Manship Chair in Journalism and Mass Communication. Dickinson taught news writing and ethics course until 2003, when he retired and was named Distinguished Professor.
And I would say probably by the first class, he had me hooked. I loved the class. It was so interesting.
Former student Angela Broussard.
The class itself was so interesting, and the way Bill taught it really, I would say right at that time I decided I have to get a master's. Like, I'm going to pursue my master's degree because I just am in love with this profession and subject and everything about it.
He was a role model for students on how they ought to conduct themselves professionally when they leave the school and go out into their first job.
He could relate to 20-year-olds. He was an enthusiastic teacher. All of those guys were enthusiastic teachers. And he didn't do what a lot of professionals do, which is tell war stories. I mean, he came in to teach. Sometimes a good war story helps teach, but in the end, what you've got to do is teach them the skills and teach them what it means to be a real journalist, and he had those skills.
Jack Hamilton was dean of the Manship School when Dickinson was hired by the school. At the time, Dickinson was teaching journalism at the University of Kansas, his alma mater. Dickinson graduated from Kansas in 1953 with a degree in English. After graduating, Dickinson worked for 2 years in intelligence within the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps. Several years later, he joined the United Press in Kansas City, Missouri, his hometown. Later, he was state manager for the UP in Santa Fe, New Mexico, before being transferred to the Washington, D.C. Bureau. Washington would be Bill's home for nearly 25 years. After working for the UP, Dickinson worked as a writer and later editor for the Editorial Research Reports, a nonpartisan research organization. Editorial Research Reports would eventually be called the Congressional Quarterly, where Bill worked until 1971 when he was hired away by the Washington Post. Dickinson was hired as the first editorial director and general manager of the startup Washington Post Writers Group, a press syndication service composed of opinion journalists, editorial cartoonists, comic strips, and columnists.
One of the high points of his life was his work creating and maintaining the Washington Post Writers Group, which had a stable of just exceptional writers as part of it. And you know, you're dealing with people who have a very good journalistic pedigree and don't expect to be heavily edited, but everybody needs to be edited and everybody needs to be guided. So Bill had to make sure that they turned out good stories, and he had to work with them on that. He had to make sure it was profitable, and he had to sell the service. And so when you deal with thoroughbreds, you know, you can't just be any old trainer. You've got to be really highly skilled.
For 18 years, Dickinson managed and edited the Washington Post Writers Group. When the syndication began in 1971, there was one columnist. Under Dickinson's leadership, that number eventually grew to 31, including 8 Pulitzer Prize recipients.
On top of all of that, during the short time that he was here, he had a tremendous impact on the way we did things and impact on the students that he taught. And that's one of the things that we look at in selecting somebody for the Hall of Fame is what has been the impact of that individual. And quite frankly, his legacy is far greater than the short amount of time that he spent here.
I just always wanted to be like him as a grown-up. You know, as a little kid, you say, that's who I want to be like. Well, as a grown-up, I still to this day would like to emulate Mr. Bill because he's just that kind of person. He's exceptional.
There's one thing that suggests how admired Bill was, is there's an endowed professorship at the school in his name, but it was funded by Katharine Graham's assistant out of her own pocketbook, which, by the way, she's here tonight. She's a great friend of Bill's. That's a pretty wonderful thing when people respect you so much that they don't create a professorship in their name. They create it in somebody else's name. And in fact, when I approached Liz Hilton about this, I suggested she could put her name. She said, oh no, I would never do that. I'll put in Bill Dickinson's name.
Congratulations to William Bill Dickinson, 2018 LSU Manship School of Mass Communication Hall of Fame inductee.